this episode of Two Wheels, One Compass, we're going to dive into the progressive era history of Minnesota, much like we did with North Dakota. As I'd mentioned, of all the Democratic parties across the United States, only two are named differently: the Democratic Nonpartisan League of North Dakota and the Democratic Farmer-Labor Party of Minnesota. The most powerful and successful third party the United States had ever seen was the Farmer-Labor Party of Minnesota, which was born out of the progressive era. In our 3 episodes on the Nonpartisan League in North Dakota, we talked about the progressive era that took place after the Gilded Age of the late 19th century. The children who worked in the mines and factories were now all grown up and ready to give their own children a better life. Around World War I, and after Teddy Roosevelt's run on the Progressive Party ticket, the Bull Moose Party, a lot of progressive movements were beginning nationally and around the industrialized world. Workers of the Industrial Revolution were ready to rein in and regulate the power of industry, some much more than others. Some more social democratic reforms were weekends, holidays, 40-hour work week, passing minimum wage and anti-child labor laws, and subsidies for farmers. Communists also started gaining traction during this era, looking to nationalize industry entirely. Teddy Roosevelt's run on the Progressive Party ticket was how the progressive movement really gained national momentum. Roosevelt used to be a Republican, and running as a progressive bull moose, as he called it, he split the Republican votes with Taft, leading way to a Democratic presidency under Woodrow Wilson, who would lead the country over the course of World War I. During Teddy's 1912 run, 9 representatives were sent to Congress from his Progressive Party. A representative from Wisconsin's Socialist Party also held on to a seat for a while. State and local offices at all levels started to see socialist candidates winning many seats. Over the course of the 19-teens, progressive parties were cropping up on a local level all over the United States, many of which were fragments of the progressive campaign structure of Teddy's 1912 run. After World War I, echoes of the Progressive Party coalesced into the Socialist Party, which had a sway on local politics nationwide. The figurehead of the early 20th century Socialist Party was Eugene Debs, who had ran for president on the Socialist Party ticket. He was involved in the Pullman strike, which began as a result of a recession called the Panic of 1893. We talked about Pullman, the Pullman strike, and that recession back in episode 44. In Minnesota, over the course of the 19-teens, 4 state senators, 5 state representatives, 9 mayors, including the mayor of Minneapolis, were a part of the Socialist Party of Minnesota. There were also 12.5 city councilors. World War I, the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, and the First Red Scare severely decimated the Socialist Party in the years following the Great War up until 1920. The elites of the United States started to fight back against the progressives who were fighting against the downsides of a capitalist economy. During this time, former members of the Progressive Party, who were then members of the Socialist Party, got together to form the Nonpartisan League of Minnesota, which changed its name to the Farmer-Labor Party of Minnesota. The Farmer-Labor Party acted as a local progressive offshoot of the Socialist Party, where progressive union leaders, as well as farmers, would fight for more left-wing financial reforms on all levels of government. The outline of the Farmer-Labor Party's Declaration of Principles was: the farmer-labor movement seeks to unite into a political organization all persons engaged in agriculture and other useful industry, and those in sympathy with their interests, for the purpose of securing legislation that will protect and promote the economic welfare of the wealth producers. In short, the Farmer-Labor Party was a loosely associated party of both inner-city laborers and rural farmers that paid yearly dues to bring about electoral change on a state level. Their aim was to bring about public checks on monopolies, increasing available wealth by lowering income disparity through social programs and services, and the abolition of industrial autocracy, something the survivors of the Gilded Age knew quite a bit about after living through it. Many of the North Dakotan nonpartisan leaguers and the Minnesotan Farmer-Labor Party members used to be Republican. The Democratic Party was typically more popular in the Deep South, as well as amongst immigrant populations in the Northeast. It didn't have as strong of inroads in the Midwest. Over the span of 56 years or 14 presidential elections, there isn't much blue Democratic support in the Midwest. The Farmer-Labor Party started gaining traction and would win second place in every governor's race from 1918 to 1930, when in the context of the Great Depression, the Farmer-Labor Party built their first administration with Governor Floyd B. Olson. Olson first got his farmer-labor support when, as a Hennepin County attorney, against death threats, he prosecuted crooked businessmen, the Ku Klux Klan, and the Minnesota Citizens Alliance, a conservative business organization that opposed unions and even sent dynamite to the home of a union leader. During his time as governor, even with a more conservative Republican state legislature, he passed much of the Farmer Labor Party's platform's reforms, and Minnesota saw a progressive income tax, Social Security for the elderly, expansions of their environmental conservation programs, equal pay for women, the right to collective bargaining, a minimum wage, and unemployment insurance. Much of the country wouldn't see these reforms until FDR's New Deal later in the 30s. The Farmer Labor Party would go on to hold the Minnesota governor's mansion for 4 terms going into the Great Depression. Throughout the 20s and 30s, if you look at the U.S. House of Representatives, you'll slowly start to see the Farmer Labor Party take hold of Minnesotan politics on the national stage. The lack of regulations under Republican administrations brought about the Great Depression, where the Republican Party saw devastating nationwide losses. The power vacuum was filled by Democrats across much of the U.S., but in Minnesota, even senators were being sent to Washington from the Farmer Labor Party. Wisconsin, next door, was also sending members of its Progressive Party as well. Another Roosevelt, this time Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or FDR, was the progressive president that had got the United States through the Great Depression and World War II. His New Deal reforms were something never seen in the United States before. Many of the reforms that the Farmer Labor Party fought for were being championed by FDR. To help Americans out of the Depression, he enacted a series of public work projects, financial regulation reforms, and Social Security came about for the first time. New Deal laws were aimed at helping the youth, farmers, the unemployed, and the elderly. It was during the 1940s that the progressive movements such as the Nonpartisan League of North Dakota and the Farmer Labor Party of Minnesota aligned with the Democratic Party. In 1943, the Farmer Labor Party officially merged with the Democratic Party, becoming the DFL, or Democratic Farmer Labor Party, which holds on to this name today. If you vote for a Democratic candidate in Minnesota, your ballot doesn't say Democratic Party, but Democratic Farmer Labor Party. This graphic is a visualization of the control of the U.S. House, Senate, and White House over the course of the last 166 years. This shows what party has House control, and by how many percent. This shows what party has Senate control, and by how many percent. And this shows what party has White House control. Each of these blocks are 2-year terms in Congress, and each of these are 4-year terms in the White House. During this reform period of more social democracy, from 1933 to 1969, Democrats held the White House for 7 out of 9 terms. They held on to national power by representing the interests of many different voting blocs known as the New Deal Coalition. This included a group of ethnic whites, which would be your non-Anglo-Saxon Americans that were not from old stock, such as Italians or Irish, labor unions, Southern traditional, more racist Jim Crow Democrats, and progressive groups such as your socialists, communists, democratic socialists, farmers, and even some ethnic minorities such as blacks in Midwestern inner cities like Chicago and Detroit. The United States came into the post-war period as a financially left-wing country. Even Republicans who would run for office would tout the importance of social safety nets and strong government programs.
But I was a liberal before many of those men heard the word. I believe that the forces of free enterprise must be regulated. I'm opposed to business monopoly. I believe in the right of collective bargaining by labor. I believe in minimum standards for wages and maximum standards for hours.
Many Republicans during this period were split between those who favored New Deal reforms and those who wanted them removed to tip the scales back in favor of private industry and big business. A party realignment occurred after the New Deal coalition would start to break apart with the Civil Rights Movement. JFK, the first ethnic white president, turned his back on Southern Democrats with the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Southern Democrats, still coming from a long line of Democrats going back to the rebellion in the Civil War, would begin to lose their elections to Republicans until the South had become a Republican stronghold thanks to Nixon's Southern strategy. You can see how, with each presidential election, as the Democratic Party started shifting toward favoring the Civil Rights Movement, the Solid South, as it's been called since the Civil War, started to back third-party candidates. Eventually, they shifted into the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln that took slavery from the South altogether. It's been that way ever since. The Cold War also played a huge part in tilting the scales away from strong government programs, as right-wing presidents such as Ronald Reagan would campaign on private market solutions that many can claim has pushed the country to the right ever since. Okay, so I shifted from the state progressive movement of the Farmer Labor Party into the national financial left-wing, right-wing paradigm. So I think it's important to talk about it because coalitions are how political parties survive. Bringing in groups of people from different religions, races, financial statuses, education, it's how democracies form parties that end up forming governments. Where I'm headed, moving eastward, is a region where the DFL is beginning to see a fracture between two factions of its coalition on a state level. I'm riding into the Iron Range, which has been a DFL stronghold for generations. The progressives of northeast Minnesota now have a fragile coalition as the union pro-labor miners clash over issues with environmentalists regarding the resource extraction and mineral-rich forests of the North Woods.